Today, what we're going to be talking about is boundaries. It's a balancing act. How do we set our boundaries in such a way that we consider the needs of the clients, the needs of ourselves, and also ethics? So, I don't know about you, but I actually find boundary setting one of those really challenging things. And so, what I've done is I've produced a whole podcast on it. And the podcast on boundaries is about being able to actually set boundaries for our own self care. It's out on Thursday, the 28th of March, 2024. But as I've been thinking about boundaries a little bit more, I thought I'd maybe expand and talk about it in a bit more detail. And I actually find boundaries quite a difficult thing to deal with, not only because I find it difficult to protect my own self-care by setting boundaries, because I quite often just really want to get on with, say, work. So I find it difficult to have boundaries around stopping work. I can have difficulties in setting boundaries so that I've got space between clients. Those sorts of things I can actually really struggle with. But also there's other areas of boundaries that I struggle with as well. And I would say my biggest thing that I kept tripping over was boundaries around cancellations. And I'll share how I've particularly resolved that one a bit later in the talk. But I don't know if you saw the question that I asked yesterday on my Facebook page, but I'll just read them out again. So one is that you rarely make exceptions. Two is you're open to being flexible where necessary. And three, your boundaries are fairly fluid and you adjust them regularly. So which one are you? Let me know in the comments, and I'll keep an eye and see what people are saying. So I think for me, the thing that I find a struggle is obviously there's the stuff around caring for myself and putting my needs sort of first and foremost. And that's probably my biggest struggle, actually. And then the other part that I struggle with is when it comes to meeting people's human needs, really, because one of the things that has always really stuck with me was that ethical thing. I can't think of another word apart from thing. That one of the ethics that I learned when I was training was about equality and treating all of the clients the same, to make sure that they are treated with equality. And I think I've got really hung up on this, and I've sort of thought to myself, well, if I do it for one person, that means I've got to do the same for everybody. But actually, I think as time's gone on, I've sort of moved to a different position, and that is that people are individuals. And that some people might need a particular type of boundary, whereas others don't. Because I think sometimes we can get so hung up on almost black and white thinking. And I think that's where I was, just really black and white thinking, right, it's got to be like this. And I did find it really surprising, actually, when I put that question up yesterday. I thought the vast majority of people would say, I've got my boundaries and I rarely make exceptions. Because when you read through the Facebook posts where people are talking about their boundaries, quite a lot of people come across as, yep, this is the way it is. And I think perhaps that's given me a false impression, actually, of where everybody is with boundaries. Because the really interesting thing was when I looked at what people are saying, and okay, it's only a very small sample of people who've answered, and if you haven't answered, please do go and look for the post and answer it. But I would say, the vast majority of people have said they're open to being flexible when they're necessary, and that surprised me, really, because I thought most people were going to be on that sort of quite firm boundaries, because that's the impression that you get from the Facebook groups. So I think that's a very interesting thing, that we might shape our sense of whether or not we're doing a good job on what we read in the Facebook groups. And if you're anything like me, comparing yourself unfavorably with everybody else and thinking, oh, well, I'm quite flexible on my boundaries, so does that mean I'm not a very good counsellor? It's so easy to get sucked into these sorts of thoughts, isn't it? And I just really wanted to share that. Plus, I really wanted to share that, the other thing that sort of came up for me is who am I to be telling anybody about boundaries? Who do I think I am? But I think it's useful just to start a conversation as much as anything, and to facilitate some exploration. Because I think the thing that's really come up for me is that it's very personal to your style of therapy and to the way that you work. And what I wonder is, when you first train, if say you're trained in a particular approach, like the sort of person-centered model, like we were told right at the start, oh no, don't ask any questions, which I just think, I think most person-centered people who've been in person-centered work for a while would say, no, that was just to sort of train you in really listening more deeply and not following your own agenda. But of course you can ask questions. But, you get this sort of like set of sort of rigid thoughts in your head, I mustn't ask questions. And as you go through your training, okay, perhaps you do begin to ask a few more questions, but you are very sort of correct in the way that you do your therapy. And then after a while, when you've been qualified for a while, you start bringing in different approaches and things that you find useful. And your therapy sort of, that sort of person-centered way of doing things, it sort of gets a bit blurry around the edges. And I think the same might be true of our boundaries, that we might sort of, when we set out, have really, like, this is the way it's got to be done. And then perhaps as time goes by, we get a little bit more relaxed about it, and the boundary setting can be a little bit more blurry because we're setting it according to what the client needs. That is just a theory. I don't know what you think about it. So I think the sort of answer that I'm looking for is, when might we be flexible? When might be the occasions where we might exercise a bit of flexibility? So I'm going to give you some different scenarios where you might choose to be a bit more flexible. And then I'll tell you where I've got with my thinking around cancellations and whether or not I charge people when they cancel. And I'll just do that at the end. And as I say, it is in the podcast about really finding the courage to say no and to set boundaries around when you see clients, around how many clients you actually see, in order to look after yourself. And that's what the podcast is about. But let's just sort of think about when you might be flexible in your boundaries. So if you're sort of like thinking about the client, you might be tailor your boundaries to individual clients. So, for example, one of the things that might happen is perhaps if you have a client who needs support between sessions. So it might be that perhaps sort of suicidal ideation going on, or for some reason they need a bit more support between sessions, and that's something that you feel would be applicable and appropriate to them and that you can actually offer. So you might, with that particular client, tailor some sort of package together where they get more support. And I've done this, and that normally I would see people once a week, but I have been asked by clients if I could see them twice a week, and that's what I did. So I tailored that boundary for that particular client. Now, boundaries, obviously, as well, a second way that you might be flexible with your boundaries is you might adapt them as time goes on. So you may find in that example of the client who's seeing you or contacting you between sessions, gradually over time, they settle down, and then you can start to maybe change the boundaries around how much they contact you between sessions. So you might gradually reduce the number of check-ins that they have, for example. So if that's the case, what you're doing is you're adapting your boundaries and you're being flexible over time. Now, something else that might come up for you is you might decide to be flexible in your session length, for example, and that might be something that you'd negotiate with your client. So the obvious one that comes to mind is someone who finds like 50 minutes to an hour is too long for them. And so you might negotiate some flexibility there. I haven't done this in my in my counselling work, but certainly in my coaching work, I was approached by someone who said I'm ADHD, and really half an hour is as much as I can do. So that was fine. We negotiated a different boundary around the length of sessions. So that's another example of how you might be flexible. So those are just a few examples of how you might want to exercise flexibility. And I said just before I'd close that I'd let you know where I'd got to with client cancellations, because I know there's at least one person out there who's saying, I really struggle with this. And, I've tried so many different approaches, and every single time it's come back to the same thing, is that for me, if someone cancels because they're ill, that's okay. And I don't charge them. Um, that's the place where I'm at. I've never felt particularly comfortable with charging people for cancellations if they're ill or if a child's ill. So that's where I'm at. And I know other therapists, that isn't right for them. But I have tried so many different approaches, and I know that's what I like as a client. So that's what I do. And I think being able to decide to do that and to say, this is what's right for me, that was actually a really freeing moment for me. Because as I say, it's easy to look at what everybody else is doing and think that is the proper way of doing it. But actually, I think it is up to you to think about what sits well with you. Now, I have a boundary that I don't offer concessions. So, in some ways, that's a boundary that some people might think, sort of find very strict. That's my boundary. I don't offer concessions. So, I've got other boundaries in other ways that might affect you in a different way. And you might think, oh, she doesn't offer concessions. So, we all have different places where, where we sort of say, where are we going to put the clients in all of this? So, yeah, don't charge for cancellations, but no, I don't do concessions. Whereas other people might say, I do concessions, but then I always charge for cancellations. So it's very individual. So thanks for watching, and listen to the podcast. It's coming out on Thursday, all about caring for yourself and your boundaries. Okay, bye for now.